the woman who guided wagon trains across the untamed frontier of Nebraska Territory in 1858, had a secret that would have cost her everything if discovered. But Calista Norwood refused to let fear dictate her life when destiny called louder than convention. She stood atop her covered wagon in the pre-dawn darkness, her father's brass telescope pressed against her eye as she charted their course by the stars overhead. The September air held the first whisper of autumn, cool enough to raise goosebumps along her arms beneath the men's clothing she wore during these navigation sessions. 23 years old and already responsible for leading 17 families westward from Missouri, she carried a weight that would have broken lesser souls. "Miss Norwood." The voice came from below, tentative and young. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a farmer's wife barely 19 and heavy with her first child. "I cannot sleep. The baby kicks so." Calista lowered the telescope and climbed down, her boots hitting the earth with a soft thud. "Walk with me," she said gently, offering her arm to the pregnant woman. "Movement sometimes helps." They strolled between the circled wagons, stepping carefully over sleeping forms and around dying campfires. The Great Plains stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of grass beneath a ceiling of stars. Calista had learned celestial navigation from her father, a ship's captain who had retired inland, only to find himself teaching his daughter the same skills that had guided him across actual oceans. "Are you frightened?" Sarah asked suddenly, "leading all these people into the unknown?" "Every single day," Calista admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "But fear means we are alive, and being alive means we get to choose courage." Sarah squeezed her hand. "My husband says you navigate better than any man he has known. Your husband is kind." Calista smiled in the darkness. "But what matters is getting everyone safely to Oregon Territory, not whether I wear skirts or trousers while doing it." A sound from beyond the wagon circle made both women freeze. Callista's hand moved to the pistol at her hip, a weapon she had hoped never to use but had learned to fire with deadly accuracy. The sound came again, closer this time, revealing itself as hoofbeats. "Stay behind the wagons," Calista whispered urgently, guiding Sarah toward safety before moving forward herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she called out into the darkness. "Identify yourself." "Just a traveler seeking direction," came the response, male and weary. "I mean no harm. Show yourself slowly, hands where I can see them." A horse emerged from the shadows, its rider slumped forward in the saddle. As he entered the faint glow of the nearest campfire, Calista saw he was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Blood stained his shirt along the left shoulder. "I have been riding for 2 days," he said, his voice rough. "Following the North Star, trying to catch up to the Henderson wagon train. A man in the last settlement told me they were headed to Oregon Territory." "This is the Morrison train," Calista said, not lowering her weapon. "The Henderson train left a week before us. They are likely 200 miles ahead by now." The man swayed in his saddle, and Calista realized he was fighting to remain conscious. Against her better judgment, she holstered her pistol and moved forward, catching him just as he began to fall. He was solid muscle and too heavy for her to hold, but she managed to ease his descent so he did not crack his skull on the hard ground. "Sarah, fetch Dr. Patterson," she called out. "And wake Mrs. Chen. Tell her to bring her medical supplies." The commotion had roused others, and soon Calista found herself surrounded by concerned faces illuminated by hastily lit lanterns. Mr. Morrison himself, the wealthy banker who had financed the train and nominally led it, appeared in his nightshirt and cap. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" he demanded. injured traveler," Calista explained, already working to remove the stranger's shirt to examine his wound. "He has lost blood." "We cannot take on strays," Morrison said flatly. "We have barely enough supplies as it is." "We are not leaving an injured man to die on the plains," Calista responded, her voice carrying the steel that had convinced 17 families to trust her navigation skills. "That is not who we are." Morrison sputtered, but Mrs. Chen arrived before he could formulate a response. The Chinese herbalist had joined the train with her husband and 3 children, seeking a new life where her healing skills might be valued rather than feared. She knelt beside the unconscious man, her capable hands probing the wound with practiced efficiency. "Bullet grazed him," she announced. "Not deep, but infected. He has fever. I can help, but he needs rest, clean water, proper food." "He can share my wagon," Calista heard herself say. The words surprised her even as they left her mouth, but she continued anyway. "I have space, and someone needs to watch him through the fever." "Highly improper," Morrison began, but his wife Martha touched his arm. "Calista has no one to answer to but herself," Martha said quietly. "And Christian charity demands we help those in need." The debate concluded, they moved the stranger into Calista's wagon. She had kept her traveling quarters sparse, carrying only her navigation instruments, her father's books, and the essential supplies for survival. Now she added an unconscious cowboy to that inventory, laying him on her own bedroll while she prepared to spend the night sitting watch, as Mrs. Chen worked to clean and dress the wound. Calista finally got a proper look at the man she had taken in. Even pale with fever and blood loss, he possessed a striking quality. His features were strong but not harsh, his hands calloused from hard work but long-fingered and surprisingly elegant. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, trail-worn but of decent quality. "Who are you?" she whispered to his unconscious form. "And what sends you riding half-dead across the frontier? The wagon train would not move today." Morrison declared they needed rest anyway, having pushed hard for the previous week, and Calista used the delay to catch up on her astronomical observations. The stranger, whom they had discovered was named Yates Bradford according to papers in his saddlebag, drifted in and out of fever dreams, sometimes calling out names she did not recognize. She sat beside him through the worst of it, cooling his forehead with damp cloths and listening to his delirious rambling. He spoke of a ranch in Texas, of a brother named Marcus, of following stars to find something he had lost. When the fever finally broke on the second day, she was dozing in her chair, her telescope forgotten in her lap. "You are not Marcus," were his first coherent words. Calista jerked awake, nearly dropping the expensive instrument. "No, I am certainly not. I am Calista Norwood, navigator for this wagon train. You are Yates Bradford according to your papers, and you have been fevered for 2 days." He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "My horse, being cared for, a fine animal, exhausted but recovering faster than you are. I need to keep moving. The Henderson train is long gone and well beyond your catching even if you were healthy," Calista interrupted. "Which you are not. That wound became infected, and you are lucky Mrs. Chen knows her craft, or you would have lost the arm, possibly your life." Yates closed his eyes, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I was supposed to meet someone. I promised I would be there." Something in his voice made Callista's throat tighten. She recognized that tone, had heard it in her own voice when her father died and left her alone in St. Louis with nothing but his books and instruments. It was the sound of someone who had lost more than they knew how to bear. "Tell me," she said softly, setting aside the telescope, "if you can." He was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Yates Bradford had been the younger son of a Texas rancher, never expected to inherit or amount to much. His older brother Marcus had been everything a firstborn should be: strong, capable, destined to take over the family holdings. Yates had drifted, working as a ranch hand, sometimes hiring out as a cowboy on cattle drives, learning the land and the stars that guided travelers across it. Then Marcus had fallen in love with a woman named Elizabeth Henderson. She was the daughter of a merchant planning to take his family to Oregon Territory, seeking land and opportunity. Marcus had begged her to stay, but Elizabeth had a wandering spirit that matched the age they lived in. She had promised to write, to wait for him in Oregon while he settled the ranch and sold his portion to their father. "Marcus died 3 months ago," Yates said, his voice hollow. "Thrown from a horse, broke his neck. He made me promise, with his dying breath, that I would go to Oregon and tell Elizabeth what happened. That I would make sure she knew he loved her, that he was coming, that his death was the only thing that could have stopped him." Calista felt tears prick her eyes. "So you rode after her train?" "I thought I could catch them. I pushed too hard. My horse went lame in Kansas Territory. I had to buy another. Then I ran into trouble with some claim jumpers who thought I looked like easy pickings." He touched his wounded shoulder gingerly. "They learned otherwise, but not before one of them got off a shot. And you kept riding. I made a promise to my brother. It is all I have left of him." She understood then, with the crystalline clarity that comes from recognizing your own pain in another person. Yates Bradford was not just following a wagon train west. He was following the last request of someone he loved, trying to make meaning from senseless loss. "The Henderson train left White Pine Station a week before we did," Calista said slowly. "That was 12 days ago. They have a good lead, but they are moving slowly. 2 of their wagons have mechanical troubles, or so we heard. If we push hard, we might overtake them before they reach Fort Kearney." Yates's eyes opened, fixing on her with sudden intensity. "You cannot ride alone, not with that wound." "And I." She hesitated, then committed. "I could use someone who knows the stars, someone to help with navigation. My observations would go faster with an assistant, which would benefit everyone on this train." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. But Yates nodded slowly, accepting the fiction that let him keep his pride while accepting her help. "I can earn my passage," he said. "I am good with horses, and I can handle a rifle. If you need hunting done, protection, repairs to the wagons. Then we have an arrangement." Calista extended her hand, and after a moment, Yates shook it. His palm was warm against hers, calloused in the same places as her own from handling reins and rope. The contact lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary, and when she pulled away, she felt oddly breathless. 3 days later, Yates was well enough to ride. Morrison had argued against the delay, but Calista had pointed out that they needed to rest the oxen anyway and scout ahead for the best river crossing. The trail had been hard on both animals and equipment, and pushing forward recklessly could strand them all. Now, as they prepared to move out again, Calista watched Yates work with the horses. He had a gift with them, she noticed. Even the most skittish animals calmed under his hands, responding to his low voice and patient manner. Her own mare, usually standoffish with strangers, had taken to him immediately. "You are staring," Sarah Mitchell observed, coming to stand beside her with a knowing smile. The pregnant woman had appointed herself Callista's confidante, much to Callista's mixed feelings. "I am observing," Calista corrected. "There is a difference, of course, and I am merely expanding, not growing rounder by the day." Despite herself, Calista laughed. "How are you feeling?" "Any more sleepless nights?" "Better now that we have stopped moving, though I will be glad when this child decides to make an appearance." Sarah's expression turned sly. "He is handsome, your cowboy." "He is not my cowboy. He is a passenger who needed help, who you insisted on nursing personally, who you convinced Morrison to wait for, who you watch every chance you get." "I do not." "Calista," Sarah's voice was gentle now, "you have spent every moment of this journey focused on getting us safely west. You wake before dawn to study the stars. You ride ahead to scout the trail. You settle disputes and manage supplies and carry weights no one else can see. When do you do something for yourself?" The question hit harder than Calista wanted to admit. She had been so focused on honoring her father's legacy, on proving that a woman could navigate as well as any man, that she had forgotten to consider what she wanted beyond reaching Oregon Territory. "He is on a mission," she said quietly, "to honor his brother's last request. I am helping him reach Elizabeth Henderson, nothing more. And after, when you have found this woman and delivered his message—" Calista had no answer. The wagon train rolled west, following the Platte River toward Fort Kearny. Calista had made this journey twice before as her father's assistant, and the landmarks were familiar. She knew which river crossings were safest, where to find good grazing for the animals, which settlements were welcoming and which were best avoided. Yates proved invaluable, just as she had predicted. He rode ahead with her on scouting missions, his sharp eyes spotting potential dangers she might have missed. He was good with a rifle, bringing down game to supplement their provisions. And in the evenings, when she climbed atop her wagon to take astronomical readings, he stood below and recorded her observations with careful precision. "Polaris at 83 degrees, she called down, her eye pressed to the telescope. "Mark it." "Marked," Yates replied, his voice carrying through the darkness. "What does that tell you?" "That we are making good time. Better than expected, actually. If the Henderson train is moving as slowly as reported, we should overtake them within a week." She should have felt satisfaction at this news. Instead, something uncomfortable twisted in her chest. A week meant this fragile partnership would end. Yates would deliver his message, fulfill his promise, and then what? Continue to Oregon with the Henderson train. Return to Texas. Strike out on his own, Calista. His voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Are you finished?" "Yes, sorry. Wool gathering." She climbed down but misjudged the last step in the darkness. She would have fallen, but Yates caught her, his hand strong on her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, her hands braced against his chest, his face inches from her own. She could feel his heart beating beneath her palms, rapid and strong. Could see the way his eyes had darkened, the way he was looking at her mouth. "Calista," he breathed, and her name had never sounded like that before, like a prayer, like a promise. She pulled away, her own heart racing. "Thank you, I should have watched my step. You should." But his voice was rough, affected. "Cannot have our navigator breaking an ankle." The moment passed, but it left something changed between them. An awareness that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there all along but unacknowledged. Calista lay awake in her wagon that night, listening to Yates breathing in his own bedroll on the other side of the canvas wall, and wondered what she was doing. She could not afford this. Could not afford to feel this pull toward a man who was chasing his brother's love story, not his own. Who would leave as soon as his mission was complete. Who probably saw her as nothing more than a capable navigator in practical clothing, not as a woman at all. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her in the darkness, and she was not so sure. The next morning brought trouble in the form of a broken wagon axle. The Johnsons, a family of farmers from Ohio, had been having mechanical issues for days, but the damage had finally become catastrophic. The wagon could not continue without major repairs, and they did not have the materials. "We will have to leave them behind," Morrison announced at the emergency meeting. Give them some supplies and directions to the nearest settlement. We cannot delay the entire train. We are not leaving anyone behind, Calista said firmly. The Johnsons have 3 small children. Abandoning them on the plains is a death sentence. Then what do you propose? We have no replacement axle, and the nearest fort is still 4 days away. Yates spoke up from his position at the edge of the crowd. There is a settlement about 30 miles north of here. Small place, mostly just a trading post and a smithy, but they might have what we need. I could ride there, bring back an axle or the materials to fashion one. Alone, Calista did not like the idea, though she could not say why. That is dangerous. Less dangerous than splitting the train or abandoning a family. He met her eyes. I can be there and back in 2 days if I push hard. You are still healing. The wound is closed. Mrs. Chen said so herself. He smiled slightly. Are you worried about me, Miss Norwood? She was terribly, but she would not give him the satisfaction of admitting it. I am worried about losing our scout and hunter. You have made yourself useful. High praise indeed. His smile widened and she felt her face heat. In the end, they agreed to send him with Calista's blessing and a purse of coins to purchase whatever was needed. She watched him ride out with her stomach in knots, hating the fear that had nothing to do with concern for the wagon train and everything to do with the cowboy, who had somehow become essential to her in less than 2 weeks. He will return, Sarah said, appearing at her elbow like a mind-reading spirit. You look like a wife watching her husband ride to war. Do not be dramatic. I am not the one being dramatic. You should see your face. Calista forced herself to turn away from the horizon where Yates had disappeared. We have work to do. The Johnsons need their wagon emptied so we can lift it for repairs once Yates returns. And I want to scout ahead, find us a good camping spot with water and grazing. Ever the practical navigator, Sarah said, but her eyes were kind. Just remember, Calista, that you are also a woman with a heart. There is no shame in admitting when someone has claimed it. The words haunted Calista as she went about her duties. Was that what had happened? Had this cowboy with his sad eyes and determined mission somehow claimed her heart without her noticing? She had not been looking for love, had not thought she had room in her life for such complications. Her entire focus had been on establishing herself as a navigator, proving her father's training had not been wasted on a daughter instead of a son. But watching the families on her train, seeing the way husbands and wives supported each other through the hardships of the journey, she had started to wonder if maybe her father's greatest lesson had not been about the stars at all. He had shown her that love meant teaching someone everything you knew, trusting them with your legacy, believing in them when the world said they were not enough. Perhaps that was what she saw in Yates. Someone who understood about legacies and promises. Someone who would ride until his horse dropped to honor his brother's last request. Someone who looked at her like she was more than just a competent navigator in men's clothing. The settlement where Yates had gone was indeed small, little more than a handful of buildings clustered around a creek. But the smithy was run by a German immigrant named Klaus who took pride in his work and kept a well-stocked supply of materials. Wagon axle, yes, I can make, Klaus said in heavily accented English. But will take time. Must forge proper, not rush, or will break again on trail. How long? Yates asked, trying to hide his impatience. Tomorrow evening if I work through night. You have money? Yates paid half upfront and settled in to wait. The delay chafed at him, but he knew better than to push a craftsman. A poorly made axle would be worse than no axle at all. He spent the time thinking about Calista Norwood, which was becoming a dangerous habit. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, and he had known his share. Where other women simpered and played coy, she spoke her mind directly. Where they wore delicate dresses and worried about propriety, she wore practical clothing and worried about keeping 17 families alive on a treacherous journey. She was brilliant, too, in a way that intimidated and attracted him in equal measure. Watching her work with that telescope, calculating positions and distances with mathematical precision, he felt like he was seeing something sacred. She read the stars the way he read the land, with an intimacy born of deep study and natural talent. And she was beautiful, though he suspected she had no idea. Beauty was not in delicate features or artful curls. It was in the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the graceful efficiency of her movements. It was in the gentle way she spoke to Sarah Mitchell, the firm way she handled Morrison, the patient way she had nursed him through his fever. He was falling in love with her, Yates realized with a jolt. Had been falling since the moment she had caught him when he tumbled from his horse. Maybe before that, when she had called out of the darkness demanding he identify himself, her voice fearless and strong. But what right did he have to love her? He was a drifter with no prospects, riding west to deliver a dead man's message. She was a navigator, a woman with a calling and a purpose. She was going to Oregon Territory to establish herself, to build a reputation. She did not need a broken-down cowboy with nothing to offer but a good hand with horses and a knowledge of the stars. Still, when he closed his eyes that night in the trading post's loft, it was her face he saw. Her voice he heard. And when he rode out the next evening with the new axle lashed to his saddle, it was the thought of seeing her again that made him push his horse harder than he should have. Calista saw the dust cloud on the horizon 2 hours before Yates arrived. She had positioned herself at the edge of camp, ostensibly to watch for dangers but really just to watch for him. When his horse finally came into view, she had to physically restrain herself from running to meet him. He looked exhausted, covered in trail dust and swaying slightly in the saddle. But his face lit up when he saw her, and that smile did dangerous things to her composure. "Miss Norwood," he said, tipping his hat. "I return victorious, bearing gifts of German craftsmanship." "You look half dead," she said, trying to sound stern. "How fast did you ride?" "Fast enough." He dismounted, wincing slightly as his boots hit the ground. "Wanted to get back before you all decided to abandon me and ride on. We would not have left you." The words came out more intense than she had intended, revealing too much. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the noise of the camp faded away. There was only this man and this woman standing in the fading light, acknowledging something neither was quite ready to name. "Calista," he said softly, and the use of her first name sent shivers down her spine. "Yates." "I was thinking while I rode." "Mr. Bradford," Morrison's voice shattered the moment. "You have the axle. Excellent, excellent. We will begin repairs immediately. With any luck, we can move out by noon tomorrow." The spell broken, they turned to the practical matters of fixing the wagon. But something had shifted between them. A line had been crossed. They both knew it, even if neither was ready to address it yet. The repairs took most of the night, with Klaus's well-crafted axle fitting perfectly and the men of the train working in shifts to complete the installation. By morning, the Johnsons' wagon was rolling ready, and Morrison was anxious to make up for lost time. They pushed hard over the next 3 days, covering ground at a pace that tested both people and animals. Calista drove them forward, knowing that Fort Kearny was close and that there they could rest, resupply, and get news of the Henderson train. Yates rode beside her at the head of the column, and she found herself relying on his judgment more and more. He had a sense for the land that complemented her celestial navigation, reading signs in the grass and soil that told him where water could be found, which paths would be easiest for the heavy wagons. "You are good at this," she told him one evening as they sat together studying her maps by firelight. "Reading the trail. You have done this before." "My brother and I used to dream about it," he said quietly. "Going west, starting fresh somewhere new. We would lie on our backs at night, looking up at the stars, planning all the things we would do when we were free of the ranch." He paused. "He fell in love instead, and I stayed because he stayed, and now he is gone." "Is that why you are doing this?" Calista asked, delivering his message. "Because you feel guilty for the dreams you did not chase together?" Yates was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe, partly. But also because I loved him, and this is the last thing he asked of me, the last way I can be his brother." She understood. Had she not spent 2 years proving herself as a navigator, because it was what her father had taught her, what he had believed she could do? Some legacies were burdens, but others were gifts. The trick was learning which was which. "When we find Elizabeth Henderson," she said slowly, "what will you do then?" "I do not know." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "What do you want me to do?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Calista opened her mouth, not sure what she would say, but Sarah's voice interrupted. "Calista, come quick. The baby is coming." They ran together across the camp, finding Sarah's husband James white-faced and panicking outside their wagon. Sarah's cries came from inside, and Mrs. Chen was already there, her medical supplies spread out and her face calm. "First babies take time," Mrs. Chen said when Calista climbed into the wagon. "But all seems well. Strong heartbeat, good position. She needs support, friendly faces." So Calista stayed, holding Sarah's hand through the long hours of labor. Yates remained outside with James, keeping the anxious father from wearing a hole in the ground with his pacing. As dawn broke over the plains, a new voice joined the sounds of the waking camp. "A boy," Mrs. Chen announced, placing the squalling infant in Sarah's arms, healthy and loud. Sarah looked down at her son with tears streaming down her face, then up at Calista. "Thank you for everything, for getting us this far safely." Calista felt her own eyes burn. "You did the hard part." "We will name him after my father," Sarah said. "Charles James Mitchell, but his middle name will be in honor of the woman who guided us here." She smiled. "Charles Calista Mitchell, so he always remembers that courage comes in unexpected forms." Outside, Yates congratulated James with handshakes and backslapping, then found Calista standing alone, looking out at the sunrise. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "A good night's work," he said. "The best." She felt lighter somehow, watching the sun paint the plains gold and rose. "This is why I do it, you know, leading these trains. Moments like this when new life comes into the world and everything feels possible. I am beginning to understand that." He took a breath. "Calista, when we find the Henderson train." "Fort Kearny is ahead," she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say, afraid of hoping too much. "We should reach it by tomorrow. We can get news there, find out how far ahead they are, Calista. We should prepare to move out. Morrison will want an early start." She fled before he could finish, her heart pounding, because she knew what he had been about to say, and she was terrified. Terrified of losing him once his mission was complete. Terrified of asking him to stay for her instead of continuing on. Terrified of admitting she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love. Fort Kearny rose from the plains like a promise, its sturdy walls and American flag visible for miles. The wagon train rolled in to cheers from the soldiers stationed there, who were always glad to see new faces and hear news from the east. The commander, a weathered captain named Reynolds, greeted them warmly and directed them to camping spaces within the fort's protective perimeter. More importantly, he had information. "The Henderson train passed through 5 days ago," he told Calista and Morrison. They are moving slowly. Lost a wagon to a river crossing gone wrong, and they have had illness in the camp. Nothing serious, but enough to slow them down. 5 days. Calista's mind raced through calculations. With the Morrison train's faster pace, they could overtake the Henderson train within a week, maybe less. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "We will rest here for 2 days, then continue on." She found Yates at the fort's small stable, tending to the horses as he always did. He looked up when she approached, and the hope in his eyes made her chest ache. "We are close," she said. 5 days ahead, moving slow, we will catch them. Good, that is good. But he did not sound happy. He sounded as miserable as she felt. "Yates, I am going to ask you something," he interrupted, "and I want you to really think before you answer. Not as the navigator of this train, but as Calista, just Calista." Her heart began to hammer. "All right. When we catch the Henderson train, and I deliver my message to Elizabeth, will you let me come back? To your train, to you? Will you let me stay, not as a passenger or a scout or anything, but as a man who—" He took a breath. "As a man who has fallen in love with you." The world seemed to stop. Calista stared at him, at this cowboy who had ridden half dead across the frontier, who had helped fix wagons and hunt game and record astronomical observations, who had somehow seen past her practical clothing and no-nonsense manner to the woman beneath. "You love me," she whispered. "So much it terrifies me," he admitted. "I know I have no right. I am nobody, nothing, just a cowboy with a promise to keep. But these weeks with you, watching you lead these people, seeing how you care for them while pretending you are just doing a job, learning that you are as beautiful as you are brilliant." He stepped closer. "I do not want to ride away from you, Calista. I want to ride beside you wherever you go. If you will have me." She should have been practical. Should have pointed out that they barely knew each other, that he might feel differently once his mission was complete, that she had a reputation to build and a life to establish. But standing there in the dusty stable, looking into his earnest eyes, all her carefully constructed defenses crumbled. "I fell in love with you when you kept riding despite being half dead," she said. "When you promised to help people you did not know because you understand about duty and honor. When you looked at me like I was something precious instead of something strange." She closed the distance between them. "Yes, Yates Bradford. Yes, you can come back. Yes, you can stay. Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, and it was like the stars aligning, like finding true north after being lost. His hands cradled her face with a gentleness that contrasted with his calloused palms, and she gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, pouring weeks of longing into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I still have to deliver the message. I still have to honor my promise to Marcus. I know. And I would not respect you if you did not," she smiled. "But after you come back to me, we finish this journey together. And then we figure out what comes next." "Together," he agreed and kissed her again. They caught up to the Henderson train 6 days later, finding them camped along a tributary of the Platte River. The 2 wagon trains merged temporarily, and Calista watched as Yates went to fulfill his brother's dying request. Elizabeth Henderson was a pretty woman of 25, with auburn hair and sad eyes. When Yates approached her, explaining who he was and why he had come, she listened with her hand pressed to her mouth. "Marcus is dead," she whispered. "But he promised to follow. He promised we would build a life in Oregon." "He tried," Yates said gently. "He was selling his portion of the ranch, getting everything ready. He never stopped thinking of you. These are his letters." He handed her a bundle of envelopes. "He wrote one every week after you left. He wanted you to have them, to know how much he loved you." Elizabeth took the letters with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. Her father, a stern-faced merchant, put his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you for bringing these," Mr. Henderson said gruffly. "It could not have been an easy journey." "My brother deserved to have his words heard," Yates replied, "even if he could not speak them himself." He walked away then, his mission complete, his promise fulfilled. Calista met him at the edge of the camps, and without a word he pulled her into his arms. "It is done," he said into her hair. "I kept my word. You did. Marcus would be proud. Now I get to keep the promise I made to myself." He pulled back to look at her. "To build a life with you if you still want that." "More than anything," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. The Morrison and Henderson trains traveled together for the next week, a massive convoy of hope and determination rolling across the plains. Calista found herself spending time with Elizabeth, who had read Marcus's letters and was grieving deeply, but with a quiet dignity. "He loved you very much," Calista told her one evening as they walked together. "Yates said Marcus's dying thoughts were of making sure you knew that." "I knew," Elizabeth said softly. "I always knew, but I could not stay in Texas. I needed to see what lay beyond the horizon." "Does that make me terrible?" "It makes you human. We cannot control who we love or what we need." Elizabeth looked at her shrewdly. "You are in love with Yates. Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes. He looks at you the way Marcus looked at me, like you hung the moon and stars." "Ironic, since I am the one who navigates by them," Calista said with a smile. "Will you marry him?" The question caught Calista off guard. She and Yates had not discussed marriage, had been too focused on the immediate challenges of the journey. But hearing the words spoken aloud made something settle in her chest, a rightness that felt like coming home. "If he asks," she said quietly. "He will ask," Elizabeth said with certainty. "Men like that, men who understand about promises and forever, they do not love lightly. When they give their hearts, they give everything." That night, Calista took her astronomical readings with Yates at her side as always, but when she finished her calculations, he did not immediately record them. "Calista Norwood," he said instead, "I have nothing to offer you but a cowboy's wages and a knowledge of horses. I have no land, no prospects, no family left to speak of. But I have a heart that belongs entirely to you and hands that are willing to work for whatever future you want to build." He knelt in the grass beside the wagon, and Callista's breath caught. "I am asking you to marry me," he continued. "Not because it is proper or expected, but because I cannot imagine navigating the rest of my life without you. Will you have me?" She should have thought it through, considered the practical implications, worried about how marriage might affect her work as a navigator. Instead, she dropped to her knees in front of him and grabbed his hands. "Yes," she said fiercely. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes to building a future together. Yes to navigating life side by side. Yes to everything." He kissed her there in the grass under the stars, and Calista thought her father would have approved. He had taught her to navigate by the heavens, but Yates was teaching her to navigate by the heart, and both were equally important. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher attached to the Henderson train. The ceremony was simple, held at sunset with both wagon trains gathered as witnesses. Sarah Mitchell cried through the entire event, her baby son sleeping peacefully in her arms. Mrs. Chen provided flowers she had somehow coaxed to bloom in a pot in her wagon. Even Morrison seemed moved, though he hid it behind gruff congratulations. Elizabeth Henderson stood at the front, watching with bittersweet eyes. But when the ceremony ended and Yates kissed his bride, Elizabeth smiled genuinely for the first time since learning of Marcus's death. "He would have liked this," she told Yates afterward, "seeing you happy. He always wanted that for you." "Thank you," Yates said simply, "for understanding why I had to come, for making my brother's last months full of hope and love. Thank you for bringing me his words. I will treasure them always." The two wagon trains parted ways the next morning, the Henderson train moving at their slower pace while the Morrison train pushed ahead toward Oregon Territory. Calista stood with Yates, watching the other wagons disappear into the distance. "You think she will be all right?" Calista asked. "Elizabeth, eventually," Yates said. "Grief takes time, but she is strong. She will build the life she dreamed of, even if it looks different than she planned." "Is that what we are doing? Building something different than we planned?" He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I planned nothing and found everything." "How is that for navigation?" She laughed. And they turned back to their own train, to their own journey, to the future spreading before them like the endless plains. The rest of the journey to Oregon Territory took 6 more weeks, through mountain passes and river crossings, through early snowstorms and encounters with various tribes, some friendly and some less so. Through it all, Calista navigated and Yates supported, their partnership deepening with each challenge overcome. They reached the Willamette Valley in late October 1858, the trees ablaze with autumn colors and the air crisp with the promise of winter. The families of the Morrison train scattered to their various claims and destinations, tearful goodbyes mixing with excited plans for the future. Sarah and James Mitchell settled on a plot of land near a small settlement, already planning the farm they would build. They begged Calista and Yates to settle nearby, but Calista had other plans. "I am going to keep navigating," she told Sarah as they said their farewells. "There are thousands more people who need to come west, and I want to guide them. But I will return here to Oregon between journeys. This is home now." "And Yates supports this?" Sarah asked, glancing at where the men were loading supplies. "It was his idea," Calista said with a smile. "He said he did not marry me to cage me, but to fly alongside me." They did keep navigating, though with some changes. Calista established herself in Oregon City, putting out word that she would be taking on wagon trains the following spring. Yates bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, enough for a house and a barn for their horses, a place to come home to between journeys. That first winter, they built their home together, Yates doing the heavy work while Calista planned and designed. They made love in front of the fireplace while snow fell outside, learning each other with a patience and tenderness that came from genuine love. By spring, Calista had booked her first independent wagon train, and Yates rode east with her to lead them west. They became known across the frontier as the best navigation team on the trails, the woman who read the stars and the man who read the land, working in perfect harmony to guide pioneers safely to their dreams. Their first child was born in the winter of 1860, a squalling boy they named Marcus after Yates's brother. Calista navigated through her pregnancy, leading one last train west before settling in to give birth. Mrs. Chen traveled from her new home to attend the delivery, and Sarah came with 2-year-old Charles to visit the new baby. "He is perfect," Sarah declared, holding little Marcus with practiced ease. "Though I hope you plan to give him siblings. It would be a shame to waste all this practice I am getting." She did, 3 more children over the next 6 years, a daughter named Catherine after Calista's mother, twin boys, James and Henry, who were wild and rambunctious from their first breath. Calista cut back on her navigation work as the children grew, though she never stopped entirely. Yates made it clear he would support whatever she chose, whether that meant leading trains or staying home or finding some balance in between. In 1867, they received a letter from Elizabeth Henderson. She had married a farmer, a good man who understood about first loves and lost dreams. She had 2 children of her own now and wanted Yates to know that she was happy, truly happy, and that she carried Marcus in her heart but no longer let grief define her. "I am glad for her," Yates said, reading the letter by their fireplace while their children played on the floor. "Marcus would want her to find joy again." "You gave her that gift," Calista said, leaning against his shoulder. "By bringing his words to her, you let her say goodbye properly." "That matters." He kissed her temple. "I found my own gift on that journey, found you. We found each other," she corrected, "under the stars." Their children grew up hearing stories of the wagon trains their parents had led, of the vast plains and endless sky, of navigation by starlight and traveling by faith. Marcus, the eldest, showed an aptitude for mathematics and astronomy that delighted his mother. Catherine inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's way with horses. The twins were inseparable, already planning adventures they would take together when they were grown. In 1870, Calista led her last wagon train west. She was 35 years old, her children old enough to be left with Sarah while she made one final journey. Yates rode with her, of course, as he always had, and they stood together on the high plains one night, looking up at the stars that had guided them both. "You ever regret it?" she asked him. "Giving up your own plans to follow mine, I followed my own heart," he said simply. "That led me to you and you led me to this life. I have no regrets, Calista, not a single one." She believed him because she felt the same way. The girl who had stood atop a wagon in 1858, charting courses by starlight and dreaming of proving herself, had found something better than professional success. She had found partnership, love, family, and purpose, all woven together in a life richer than anything she could have planned. They returned to Oregon City to find their children had thrown a surprise celebration for their return. The house was decorated with wildflowers, and neighbors had brought food, and Sarah was crying happy tears as usual. Calista looked around at this life they had built, at the love they had gathered, and knew with absolute certainty that she had navigated true. Yates must have read her thoughts because he pulled her close and whispered, "Home." "Home," she agreed, and kissed him while their children cheered and their friends laughed, and the sun set over the valley they had claimed as their own. The years that followed were quieter but no less rich. Yates established himself as a respected horse breeder, while Calista took on occasional students, teaching young navigators the skills her father had taught her. She wrote a book on celestial navigation that became a standard reference for wagon train guides, though she published it under a pseudonym at first, knowing the work might be dismissed if readers knew the author was a woman. When the truth eventually came out, there was some controversy, but by then Calista had enough of a reputation that it did not matter. She had led over 40 wagon trains safely west, had taught dozens of navigators, had proven beyond doubt that skill mattered more than gender. The criticism faded, and her book remained in print for decades. Their children grew and scattered like seeds on the wind. Marcus became a professor of astronomy in San Francisco, never marrying but dedicating his life to the stars his mother had taught him to love. Catherine married a blacksmith and had 5 children of her own, writing her mother cheerful letters about the chaos of her household. The twins went into business together, running a freight company that transported goods across the frontier. Their knowledge of the trails learned from years of hearing their parents' stories. In 1885, Calista and Yates celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary by traveling back along the trail they had first journeyed together. The frontier had changed dramatically. Railroads now connected east to west. Towns had sprung up where once there had been only grass. Fort Kearny had been abandoned, no longer needed in this more civilized age, but the stars were still the same, and when they camped along the Platte River one night, Calista set up the same telescope her father had given her and took readings just like she had decades before. "What do you see?" Yates asked, coming to stand beside her as he always had. "Polaris, constant and true," she said, stepping back so he could look. "Some things never change." "Some things change everything," he countered, pulling her into his arms. "A navigator and a cowboy meeting by starlight." "Who could have predicted that?" "I could have," she said with a smile, "if I had been looking in the right direction." They made love under the stars that night, their bodies familiar but still capable of surprise and delight. At 50, Calista had silver threading through her dark hair, and Yates had weathered into a distinguished-looking man with laugh lines around his eyes. But when he touched her, she was 23 again, falling in love with a wounded cowboy who had followed stars to find his destiny. The next morning, they continued their journey, not west this time but in a circle, visiting the various places their children had settled. They met grandchildren who had never seen the trails their grandparents once traveled. They told stories of wagon trains and river crossings, of navigation by stars and faith in each other. When they finally returned home to Oregon City in late autumn, they were tired but content. The house welcomed them back, and Calista stood in the doorway, looking at the home they had built together, the life they had created. "No regrets?" Yates asked, using the same words she had asked him years before. "Not a single one," she confirmed. "You?" "Only that I cannot live it all over again," he said. "But then, maybe that is what heaven is, getting to love you in every possible way for all eternity." She kissed him then, tasting love and years and promise all mixed together. "Then we have heaven right here." They lived out their days in that house, surrounded by visits from children and grandchildren, by friends from the old wagon trains, by students seeking wisdom about navigation and life. Calista taught until the week before she died at 72, her mind sharp even as her body failed. Yates held her hand as she slipped away, whispering about the stars waiting to guide her home. He followed her 6 months later, dying peacefully in his sleep with her name on his lips. Their children buried them together on a hill overlooking the valley, with a headstone that read, "Calista Norwood Bradford, 1835–1907, Navigator Yates Bradford, 1833–1908. Cowboy." Together they followed the stars home, but their story did not end with their deaths. Marcus published his mother's journals, which became treasured historical documents. Catherine's children carried on the family tradition of fierce independence and loyal love. The twins established a scholarship for young women studying mathematics and astronomy, honoring the grandmother who had proven such pursuits were not limited by gender. And on clear nights, travelers along what had once been the wagon trail swore they could see two figures riding together across the plains, a woman and a man, following the stars toward home. It was just a legend, of course, a romantic story told around campfires and passed down through generations. But Sarah Mitchell's descendants and Elizabeth Henderson's children and all the families who had traveled under Calista's guidance knew the truth. Real love did not die. It transformed, becoming part of the land it had traveled, part of the stars it had followed, part of the legacy it left behind. In 1920, Marcus Bradford gave a speech at the dedication of an observatory in Oregon, funded by his parents' estate. He was an old man by then, his own hair white, but his voice was strong as he spoke of the mother who had taught him to see beauty in mathematics and the father who had shown him how love looked when lived fully. They met by chance, he told the assembled crowd. A navigator and a cowboy thrown together on the frontier. But they chose each other every day after that, in ways both large and small. My mother once told me that navigation was about knowing where you were, where you wanted to go, and finding the path between the two. My father told me that love was the same. They were both right. The telescope installed in the observatory was the same one Calista had used to guide wagon trains west, lovingly preserved and still functional. Students looked through it at the same stars she had charted, seeing what she had seen, following in footsteps that had changed the frontier forever. And if sometimes, on quiet nights, the graduate students working late swore they heard a woman's voice calling out coordinates and a man's voice recording them with patient precision, well, that was just the building settling, just the wind, just the stars whispering the stories they had witnessed and would never forget. The cowboy had followed the navigator's stars to find his destiny, and in doing so, they had both found something neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed. Not just each other, though that would have been enough, but a love that transformed them, a partnership that strengthened them, a future that neither could have built alone but together made look easy. They had navigated by stars and by heart, and in the end, both had led them true. To Oregon Territory, yes, but more importantly, to home. To the place where two souls met and merged and became something new. To the life that began with a fevered cowboy tumbling from his horse and a woman who caught him and held on and never let go. Their story became legend, but for those who had known them, it was simply truth. Calista and Yates Bradford, Navigator and Cowboy, partners and lovers, parents and teachers, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that outlasted even death. And somewhere, in the starlight that still guided travelers west, their legacy continued. In every woman who pursued knowledge despite opposition, in every man who supported his partner's dreams, in every couple who chose each other every day, not because it was easy but because it was right. The wagon trains had long since stopped rolling, replaced by railroads and automobiles and eventually aircraft. But the stars remained, constant and true, still navigating those wise enough to look up and see. And among those stars, if you knew where to look and how to see, you could still find the light of two souls who had loved each other well and left the world better for it. That was their real legacy. Not the trails they had blazed or the trains they had led, though those mattered, but the proof they provided that love, real and true and fully chosen, could flourish even in the harshest conditions. That two people from different worlds could build something lasting. That following your heart was not weakness, but the truest form of navigation there was. The Navigator had guided wagon trains west. The cowboy had followed her stars to find his destiny. And together, they had written a love story that the frontier would never forget, carved not in stone but in the hearts of everyone they touched, written in the starlight they both loved, eternal as the sky itself.